the dynamic texture function will allow us to create textures on a particular object. What's more, you can then go off and save this texture, reuse it if you need be. Now, in earlier tutorials, we talked about the light blur and the noise. So this dynamic texture kind of works the exact same way, and you can kind of use the dynamic texture in place of the noise or the light blur. It really depends on what you want to use, and performance-wise too, so keep an eye out for that. And the way that this works is that I'm going to go back into my global primitives. I'm going to drag a rectangle down. I'm going to go into the transformation editor. I'm going to scale this up a little bit. I'm going to go back into my built-ins, into the texture sources, the TS tab. I'm going to drag my dynamic texture down onto my rectangle. And you can see when I do that, it adds this little dynamic texture. And if we click on the dynamic texture, we can go into the editor. First thing that you notice here is that we have two tabs. We have a texture and a dynamic. Within the texture, it works just like a regular image editor or texture editor, in that we can scale this up, we can position it, rotation, stuff like that. We can even change the mapping here too as well. The other tab, dynamic, when we go into that, it has first up here a format. So if we want an RGB, RGB alpha, an alpha, a luminance alpha, or luminance, we can change it in this setting. I'm just going to leave it to RGB. Again, we have a width and a height setting, so we could change it to whatever setting we want or any pixel size that we want. Here I set it to 256, and you can see how it kind of changed that image. Again, we have a type, so we have noise, a grid, a gradient, and a light blur. So on the noise, again, we can adjust our turbulence here, and if we needed to keyframe these, we could. We also have a scale X and a scale Y. You can see how it's adjusting these images. We have a foreground color and a background color. So if we just select the little square or color square, we can come in here and change the color of that as well. The grid, as you can see, when we change this, it turns this rectangle into a grid. So I'm going to go back into my transformation editor here. I'm just going to set my rectangle to the screen size, then go back into the dynamic texture. In my dynamic tab, since we have it set to grid, we can set our little width here. So if I want to go a little bit thinner with my width and or my height, I can. If I want to increase the rows, I can increase the rows, and if I want to increase the columns too, we can do that. We also have a power that we can adjust, and below the power we have an interpolation. So right now it's on linear. We could go to constant and or spline too, and you can see the changes that it makes. Again, it will allow you to change the color as well, so we can change that color, and if you want to format, you can change to RGB alpha as well. So the next type over is called the gradient, and this is a way that you can create gradients right in Vizrt. And if you needed to save this image off again to reuse, you could. Here we have our direction, horizontal, vertical, and or diagonal. Now you notice a little line at the bottom, so if we go back into our other texture tab, we can actually scale this down or scale it up, and you can see it works just like another regular texture. As far as the gradient, if we change color again, you can see how it changes that color. So we can pretty much set any color or any type of gradient that we want here. We also have a light blur, which is kind of the exact same thing as the other plugin, the light blur here. So with the light blur, again, we have our different options here. Interpolation, we change it to constant, you see how it changes those solid lines. We have a linear and also a spline, and each one changes a little bit. We have a position X and a spread that we can adjust as well. So let's say we needed to create an image with inside of Viz. We didn't want to go back outside to Photoshop or some other image manipulation software program. We could actually create the image in here. Let's say I wanted a grid. So I'm going to set it to linear. I'm just going to set my width here a little bit smaller, maybe to 1. I'll increase my rows and columns. And now if I wanted to save this off, all I would need to do is select a folder where I'm going to save it. I'm going to take a snapshot, and we could call it grid. And now we have a little grid texture that we could use over and over within our scenes.